Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am both the host of this show as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about picky eating and other food issues with Dr. Katia Roel. She is a family doctor that specializes in feeding issues. She is the author of Love Me, Feed Me, which is coming out in its second edition. Yay! She is also the author of Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating. And she has a special interest in supporting foster and adoptive parents. Welcome back, Dr. Roel. I am so happy to have you back. This is a topic that, as you know better than most, we get a lot of questions on. So let's begin by talking about what are some of the typical food issues for foster kids or adopted kids, especially those who have experienced some type of trauma, which is, especially for kids who've been in foster care or international adoption is really the vast majority of those children.
Yeah, absolutely. Little T trauma, big T trauma, all of that impacts how kids approach meal times, food, that connected space. So some children have no challenges. So I want to put that right out there. So for some, things go pretty well, but you're right. When I talk to parent support and social workers, this is one of the number one problems that parents are dealing with. And certainly if there's been a history of food insecurity, which is very common, where the child could not count on being fed reliably, that in and of itself is a form of trauma, and that absolutely impacts how children will relate to food, both in the short term and even long term. There are ways that we can, help children feel secure and deal with that difficult beginning. So certainly the food insecurity can make children more likely to have problems with food preoccupation. So these survival hoarding behaviors, sneaking, eating very large amounts, eating very quickly, finding wrappers under the bed is a common story, or they're swiping snacks from friends at school. So we see sort of food preoccupation, as well as the sensory issues we see generally more common with selective, picky, or anxious, or even avoidant eating. So when there's been a difficult start with food, I say anything that made eating, chewing, getting food into the mouth, digested, swallowed, all of those things, if there were things that made that painful, uncomfortable, scary, if mealtimes were scary or unpredictable places, that can make kids want to avoid eating and mealtime. So we see both of those issues are kind of the main ones in terms of, not wanting to eat or seeming to want to eat too much. And also there can be challenging behaviors at the table that can be related to nervous system safety and other things. So we see a mix of different things going on often for kids around food.
Mm-hmm. And how does neurodivergence impact feeding? And we know that our kids can be neurodiverse for a variety of reasons. And quite frankly, many of them have been prenatally exposed, to alcohol or drugs, and that can also cause neurodivergence. And trauma itself can impact the brain. So how does that impact? We've talked about how trauma impacts feeding, but how does neurodivergence, just differences in brain structure, how can that affect eating and feeding?
Oh, absolutely. Lots of different things. And obviously it depends on each child, but with the neurodivergence and brain-based differences, we see those sensory differences. So a child may experience things like crunchy foods as painful, or if they are sort of you think of the sensory seeker where they're seeking that input, they may want to put hot sauce on everything. And they may have trouble if there's a sensory motor issue where they gagged or, experienced difficulties even just managing foods in their mouth. So maybe they had some scary experiences with different textures. And so that child might prefer very similar foods. That's another trait we see often with autism or trauma or brain-based differences is we might see a child very fixated on the packaging that a food comes in. So they want everything to be the same and predictable and not have sensory surprises. So these are often the kids where they're eating mostly processed foods or canned foods, and that's what they're comfortable with because it's predictable. There aren't any surprises. It's easier to chew and manage. And so we see that issue. Interoception is also sometimes affected, and interoception is just the ability to kind of figure out what's going on inside your body. And so we know that toileting is an issue, or some children with brain-based differences may not feel the cold or feel the urge to use the bathroom the same way. And so hunger and fullness cues, especially early on, may be really difficult for them to figure out, am I anxious? Am I hungry? Am I full? And so sometimes these signals coming from inside the body can be hard to tune into. But all of those things can be supported with a supportive feeding environment. So I don't want to paint it like, oh, they can't sense hunger and fullness, but there may be some challenges where we need to really be extra careful about having a supportive environment. Another thing we see is behavior. So a child who needs to fidget and move, or they're having that body experience, may not be able to sit at a table for 30 minutes. And so that may be the child who's getting up and down frequently at mealtime, or who's fidgeting or kicking the table. And so some of these things that we think of as not being polite, or as outbursts at the table, are sensory based. And so, we might have things like a weighted blanket at the table, or allowing a child to stand on their toes, or have a fidget toy. So there are lots of ways we can address these differences. And I wanted to mention that's one thing that's in the new edition of the book that really I felt very strongly about including more of. That was this flexibility in addressing some of the ways to help kids with these, brain-based differences and neurodivergence. And one last thing, if I may, about
Please.
How does neurodivergence and neurodiversity impact feeding? Parents themselves may be neurodivergent. So a parent with ADHD, or a parent who maybe is working through their own trauma or is autistic, may find things like menu planning to be more of a challenge themselves. So that also plays a role in, those connected meal times.
One of the things you say in Love Me, Feed Me is how you feed matters as much or more, or not, if not more, than what you feed. So can you explain that about the concept of the environment that we're establishing being the most important?
Yes. So, I think I have one chapter called Felt Safety Matters More Than Vegetables. And it's kind of what we're getting at is, and by the way, I came to this work as a parent. I was a family doctor having my own struggles feeding my daughter, and a lot of the advice that's out there, even from primary care, your child's pediatrician, we don't get training in this stuff. So this is very tricky in that a lot of the advice that parents, are reading online or in support groups often focus on the food. So especially around brain-based differences, there's this sense of like, well, we can cure or we can address behaviors by avoiding sugar or by pushing more fruits and vegetables or avoiding processed foods. And there's a lot of focus and anxiety around the nutrition.
And food coloring and additives and all of that, right?
All of that avoidance and fear often makes it actually harder to feed children well. So what I've found is that if we focus first on helping the child settle their nervous system, if we co-regulate, if we have those sensory activities before mealtime. So one child may need to swing for 10 minutes before a meal. Another might need 10 minutes on a screen to get in that space of their bodies being as calm as possible, having that felt safety, having that feeding environment, where they feel safe and comfortable. That is the key then to down the road of that longer term goal of improving nutrition. And it leaves space for the motivation from inside their bodies of hunger, curiosity. It leaves space for those things to emerge, and pleasure around food. And that's the path to having a child do their best with eating. Whereas if we're too focused on, getting chia seeds in the green smoothie, that goal of really optimizing nutrition, it's kind of the enemy of better nutrition. So if we can have a smoothie that's got strawberries and bananas and milk and a little cream, almost like a little breakfast milkshake, which is what I had with breakfast this morning with my daughter. When we can feed from that place of connection, joy, things that taste good, and let go of some of that worry for now, kids will find their way to that better nutrition, I believe, more quickly and actually more sustainably than if we're battling over that bite of broccoli and the child's crying and fighting and their heart rate is up and their stress hormones are up. We've kind of lost any benefit of that broccoli if the child is not in a safe space in their bodies.
What do you talk about the word felt safety and focusing on connection. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by felt safety?
Yeah, so that's a word I've seen really in the last 5 years coming up a lot more. And when I interviewed an adult adoptee and she said, "Oh, that term felt safety," it just resonates with me. It's exactly what it sounds like. You feel safe. You feel safe. And so we're learning more and more about the nervous system and how the body interacts. So felt safety is when a child, you might observe that their bodies are calm, their breathing rate is, typical. They're not panting or really slowed down. When we think about it in trauma, it's when we're not in fight or flight reaction. And that's so important, that felt safety zone. Our heart works better, our brain works better, we're open and able to learn and access curiosity and connection. Our energy storing hormones like insulin and growth hormones are optimized. Our immune system is healthy. So felt safety is our bodies are in, calm and alert, and all of the systems, including appetite and gut function, are functioning their best. When they're not in felt safety, they're having a stress response. I think parents know what that looks like. Mm-hmm. Heart rate, if it's a fight or flight, heart rate is going up. They might be angry outbursts or anxious. You see breathing rate go up. And what's happening in their bodies is their guts are shutting down. So now they can't access hunger and fullness the same way. Curiosity is gone. Their wear and tear on their bodies, the heart rate, that's what, as adults, is that elevated stroke risk and heart disease and other poor health outcomes. A child, conversely, might be in a freeze reaction where they just kind of look zoned out, or they're yawning, their heart rate tends to be lower, but they also can't access what's going on in their bodies, and it's wear and tear on the body. So felt safety is just where our bodies work best and we're able to access all of the wonderful things that help children do better with eating.
Let me pause here for a minute to tell you about another free educational resource. Thanks to our partners, the Jockey Bean Family Foundation, we now have 12 free online courses for listeners. You can find them at bit.ly/JBF support. That is bit.ly/JBF support. We have lots of titles in there, well, 12 in fact, including one of them is How to Avoid Triggering and Being Triggered by Our Kids. Let me tell you, that's a good one, and one at least I, for one, need to hear frequently. Be sure to tell a friend about them as well. So you talk also about the responsive feeding model. How does that connect with felt safety? And then let's describe and what do we mean by a responsive feeding model?
Right. So when we talk about responsive, what I love about the word responsive feeding is that it's about the warm and attuned relationship between the caregivers and the children. And we're responding to what we're observing in ourselves and in our children. And that to me is that flexibility in terms of, the child is having a meltdown and wants to have one kind of cracker over the other. When I first trained, I would have said, like, no, the parent decides what's to eat and the child eats it or doesn't eat it. And that works for some children. But if the child in front of you wants to have, wheat thins instead of Ritz or the other way around, and you sense them tipping into that 90-minute meltdown, get those crackers, get the other crackers that the child wants. And so we're prioritizing the child's nervous system and felt safety rather than some of these feeding guidelines that may not serve that child in that moment or your family in that moment. So, I used to say things like and generally still I say, routine is very reassuring. So we offer food every 2 to 3 hours. But if you had a child who was not able to focus during snack time and didn't eat much, and then 45 minutes later, they're tipping into a full-on meltdown and a cheese stick is what they need in that moment, there's more flexibility to do what works for that child and that family in the moment. So there's a little bit of that responsive piece that trusts parents and caregivers to respond to the child. But responsive feeding has some main things that in general we aim for, and then having that flexibility. So routine meals and snacks is super important to help them feel like they know they're going to be fed and can sink into that feeling of safety. So we offer food roughly every 2 to 3 hours. Now, when a child is first with you, or you have a child who's food preoccupied, you might even offer it every hour. And the message is you will be fed. You can let go of this worry. So we're offering food at regular intervals, including a food that the child generally eats. So a preferred or accepted food at every meal opportunity. So they know they can come to the table and have something they will enjoy eating. The other important piece about responsive feeding is, when at all possible, preserving the child's autonomy. So that means helping children self-serve themselves, or, letting them choose from what's on the table what to eat. So if all they want is mashed potatoes and more mashed potatoes, we don't battle over 2 bites of broccoli to get them to eat it. So there are lots of aspects of responsive feeding, but felt safety is prioritized, helping the child have autonomy whenever possible, and offering opportunities to learn to enjoy new foods. So again, my book's 300 pages, so I don't want to go on for that long, but I hope that was a bit of an introduction as to what that might look like.
I'm curious about the opportunities to try new foods, because I think the fear that a lot of parents have is that if we serve the macaroni and cheese as a food that we know the child will eat, and the child eats the macaroni and cheese and nothing else, and then the next night we serve mashed potatoes as their preferred food, and they eat mashed potatoes and nothing else, and then the next night peanut butter on a celery, well, probably not celery, peanut butter on white bread, and that's what they eat. I think parents are afraid that they're setting their kids up for a lifetime of eating nothing but macaroni, mashed potatoes, and peanut butter on white bread. Mm-hmm. So that's the fear.
Yes. Oh, that fear is very real. And like I said, I had my own feeding anxieties and fears to overcome. And I totally get that. And, there's 2 long chapters on picky eating in the book. And so there's a lot to cover here, but that fear is understandable, but we just know that the alternative doesn't work. So that is one thing I would say. It's just someone listening. How is what you're doing right now working? How does it feel for you and your child to, pre-plate and say, okay, I'm putting 1 slice of cucumber on your plate and you have to take 1 bite before you can have more mashed potatoes. I mean, I have families that have been at this for 3 or 4 years, and the children are not learning to like the mashed potatoes and the cucumber or the cucumber, or the whatever. Right. It leads to battles and power struggles, less felt safety. The kids, we know from research, the more we try to get kids to eat fruits and vegetables, the worse they do, the less they eat. of those things. And also they tend to grow less well when we have pressure. So that's the first thing to understand, is that probably what most of us have done or had done to us or are doing with our children is not helping, and it's making things worse. So understanding that first is the key. And I think a lot of parents feel that intuitively, like, oh, this isn't working. And it feels like the only choice is to bribe, reward, pressure for that one bite, or to give up and just let them eat mac and cheese all the time. But there's a lot we can do. So yes, you're right. That fear will come true. The child who has been restricted to eating their favorite foods or had to earn, dessert or the mashed potatoes by eating 2 bites of broccoli is not likely to eat the broccoli in the beginning. So knowing to expect that, I think, is really important. And so it's really kind of just a leap of faith of hanging in there, of putting the food in the middle of the table, the mashed potatoes, the broccoli, the peas, the rotisserie chicken, whatever it is. Children serve themselves, and then it's waiting. And I fill the book over and over again with quotes from parents who just say, I never thought this would work. It did work. And when we can talk about other things and children feel safe at meal times because they know they're not going to have to lick or poke or take one bite, they can calm down. And over time, and it can be very quick for many children, a week or two. For some, it may take longer, especially if they've had sensory, really pronounced sensory challenges. Over and over again, though, children want to learn to eat a variety. They'll get tired of the foods when it's not the focus, and they will learn to branch out. But it doesn't seem like they will. Doesn't seem like we can trust them to do it. But I just hear over and over again with my clients, even for those with feeding disorders, really anxious and avoidant, eating less than 10 accepted foods, it happens. Some great interviews of a mom of a teenager who came eating 5 or 6 foods. And she'd had other children in feeding therapy. And she just said, I wasn't going to do it again with, fading and chaining and making them lick and poke and taste foods, because it was battles and it didn't work. And she said, with this kid, she served one of his 5 favorite foods at every meal and snack. And, one day he just picked up an orange and ate it. And within a year, she said, he is my most adventurous eater. Now, he still struggles sometimes with choosing which foods. So some of the ADHD stuff comes in terms of meal planning or prep. But even these teenagers who seem to have really limited variety, when we take the pressure off and offer those foods in safe, enjoyable meal times, my experience has been that they're much more likely to find their way to those foods and then enjoy eating them long term.
Mm-hmm. Are you enjoying today's podcast? Obviously, we hope so. But if you are, it would help us if you would tell a friend about what you've learned, as well as about the creatingafamily.org podcast. We love strengthening and inspiring more families to raise strong and healthy kids, and you are a vital part of that by spreading the word about this weekly podcast. Okay, now I want to talk about 3 specific issues. One is, how do you handle the situation where you have a child who comes to you and remains significantly underweight? Now, sometimes just after things have settled down in their lives and they're in a place of safety, that problem resolves itself. But let's assume in a situation where that did not happen. So let's talk and then I also want to talk about how to handle extreme pickiness. That will be the second special type of circumstance. And then the third type of special circumstance is kids who are eating too much or are emotional eaters. So let's start with, you have a child who is underweight, and obviously you're getting pressure from your doctor, as well as just your concern that this child is underweight. So how would speak to parents who are worried about their child being underweight and obviously the nutritional components of that?
Yeah, this is so difficult. We also know that with alcohol exposure in utero, that we can sometimes see children who do grow tend to be smaller and have a smaller head size. So if that's a suspicion, then knowing that can help avoid pressure. Knowing that this is, something that they're likely to be smaller can help avoid pressure. So the first thing I would say is these categories of quote underweight, normal, quote overweight are so tricky, and I don't think that a lot of doctors even understand the nuance that is in this. So I see parents saying, well, my child is 20th percentile, they're underweight. But if they've always been 20th percentile and they've been growing steadily, or 10th percentile or 5th percentile even, we know that steady low growth or high growth on the charts, even if they fall in the underweight or overweight range, and all of these are, in quotes, because I find those labels really problematic. But if they've been steadily growing and, they're eating a variety that covers their nutritional basis, which even most picky eaters do, they may just be smaller than average or bigger than average, and that may be okay. So the first thing to do is not, be intervening where children are smaller than average. And that can be tricky to parse out, especially if you don't have growth charts from the first years where you can follow that. So the first thing I would say is start following and tracking growth to see what the patterns are doing. And still, even with very low weight, pressure to eat backfires. And so this is really difficult when you say, okay, well, I'm not going to pressure my quote normal weight child, but this child has been labeled failure to thrive or underweight. I have to get them to eat. And that is such a scary place to be, because that pressure still backfires. So we still have to have that faith of not pressuring, and that's scary. Everything I've said so far holds true for all of the scenarios we're talking about. So that's one of the things I love about responsive feeding as well, is you don't have to feed a bigger child or a smaller child or a child with brain-based differences fundamentally in different ways. So we can feed them all the same way. So I would say the same holds true, is work on making sure you're offering food every 2 to 3 hours. Try not to pressure, even though it's really, really hard. And focusing for a low weight child, you definitely want to make sure they have unrestricted access to their accepted or favored foods. So at, meal and snack time. So you have the mashed potatoes, you have the ketchup. If there are any condiments this child likes, sprinkles, even if they're candy sprinkles, a child where you're worried about underweight, sprinkles, dips, sauces help foods taste better. And that's why children eat. Be careful of the impulse. And I've heard some pediatricians say, well, anytime you can get them to eat, just follow them around and get a few sips and bites in. But that actually undermines those hunger cues, and they will eat less. So like almost all feeding therapists will say, nope, don't follow them around and let them eat whenever they want. I'm not a fan in that sense of, for an underweight child, or in particular in general with like having a snack drawer or a yes drawer or something that they can eat whenever they want to. Now that depends on each child, but having those sit down meals and snacks, and then having a little time where they're not eating so that they can develop that appetite is really, really important.
Okay, that makes great sense.
Yeah.
So we've
Can I mention screens too, real quick? So,
oh, please. Please.
So especially if early on a child is more comfortable eating with screens, and that helps them to regulate their nervous system, especially if you're worried about low appetite, I would let them eat with the screens or in their special beanbag, really thinking, especially if it's the clear malnutrition, thinking about, when did my child actually eat well? When did this child eat, that an entire chicken nugget or a whole piece of bread or a whole pint of blueberries, and do more of that. So especially in the beginning, if it's eating in front of a screen on the beanbag, let them do that if you notice that they're eating more, and then start with routine. So let them do that about every 2 hours, and then work towards more of the routine connected eating at the table. So figuring out where things went well in terms of them tuning into appetite, and do more of that.
Perfect. All right. Now, we've talked a little bit about it, but I want to circle back to it just to make sure we've covered it all. Now we've got a child who is an extreme picky eater, and generally that is not a child who is picky by insisting that they eat chicken and vegetables. They're usually things that we worry about nutritionally. So what would you say to parents who have a child who is limited to a very small number of foods?
Yeah, so if it's really a very small number, talking to either the pediatrician or a dietitian who knows about responsive feeding just to make sure the bases are covered. So this may be a child where a supplement or even a supplement drink may help to cover those nutritional bases. And if the child, let's say, only drinks supplement drinks or they get most of their calories from that, start by serving that at every 2 to 3 hour intervals. So we can still incorporate supplements and supplement drinks. And often the kids are actually meeting their basic nutritional needs. So that can be really important information to help us relax. And then everything I've said just about the low appetite, because often these two go together, also holds in this case. So again, it's not pressuring. Even praise can pressure. So that's something to think about too with an extreme picky eater is praise, rewards, sticker charts. That can all be felt as pressure, and it can tip kids out of felt safety. They might, or, a child with, the name pathological demand avoidance or other labels, oppositional defiance. So these kids where any suggestion from an adult to try something and they're immediately pushing back. Letting go of those reins and making it available without pressure, even asking the child sometimes, what would make this meal better for you? What would make this better for you? They might say ketchup. They might be distracted by the dog running around. It might be a screen. And so there are ways to have opportunities to interact and get more familiar with food that aren't pressure. So things like planting some mint leaves, if you don't have a garden, putting mint or basil in a pot and they can pick the mint and put it in your lemonade or your iced tea. I've often seen kids branch out with foods they're not expected to eat or at times when they're not expected to eat. So one kiddo would bake treats for the neighbor's dog, and then he would lick the peanut butter or the oats while he was doing that. Or I've had kids, making bird seed crafts and start eating the peanuts from the bird seed because they've never been pressured or expected to eat those foods. So involving them with food preparation in ways that are joyful, maybe washing potatoes without the expectation to eat it, making food that they give away where there's no expectation to eat it, mixing, say, pancake batter or cookie batter inside a baggie with their hands. All of these ways of getting more familiar with food. Another specific piece of advice is having a paper napkin available, especially if children gag or vomit. Sorry to bring that up, but
it's just part of it.
Putting a paper napkin out and telling them once or twice, if you ever want to spit something out, you just put it in the napkin and, ball it up. They're much more likely to put something in their mouth if they don't have to swallow it or spit it out, or vomit to get it out of their mouth. So offering them control and opportunities, dips, sauces, sprinkles again. Sometimes children love food straight from the freezer. So just put out a bowl of frozen peas at snack time. I've had lots of families, again, some of these will hit for some families. I put that tip on Facebook and immediately 3 or 4 people said, oh my gosh, my child has never had fruit, but I put out frozen chunks of mango, if that's safe for them to chew. And my child just ate 3 pieces of frozen mango. So sometimes thinking outside of the box in terms of what to offer can make a big difference. And often the first trying of new things is with sweets. So it might be a new flavor of ice cream. It might be a new drink. It might be yogurt. Putting sprinkles on ice cream and then sprinkles on frozen yogurt and then sprinkles on, vanilla yogurt. So all of these different ways that we can offer foods. And again, the key is that they're in that mental space, that felt safety space where their curiosity and appetite can be tuned into.
All right. And then our last special circumstance is how to handle children who are eating too much or emotional eaters.
Sure, sure. So I think one thing to start with is reframing the idea of emotional eating, and particularly where there's been food insecurity or neglect or abuse, chaotic home. I like to think of it as actually very resilient of children to have found something to access that might have helped them find a source of pleasure or something that helped their nervous systems. Food and eating can be soothing. So it may have been a coping mechanism. It may have been all they could access to deal with, oh, I'm feeling something I don't like, I'm anxious or I'm dysregulated, and food or something sweet or predictable can help them feel safer or feel better in their bodies. So I think that recognizing that that was resilient is a new lens of looking at it. And we can also, with felt safety and with everything else we're doing, help them access other ways of coping and feeling good in their bodies. And so I don't think we necessarily have to intervene and worry and stop emotional eating, but focus instead on building other ways of coping and resilience and helping children find purpose and other ways of regulating and self-soothing. And food, I don't know about you, but I find food wonderfully soothing and a source of pleasure. I have other tools, but I'll tell you, when I threw my back out for 4 days and just was in horrible pain, I remember the third day wanting a Snickers bar and just saying out loud, and I was really curious about it, I just want something to feel good on my body or with my body, because it was so painful for so long, or, luckily I don't have chronic pain, but so I think accepting that it's okay to eat when we celebrate and when we connect with others, and eating for pleasure is okay. And that working on all those other things helps that go away. For kids who seem to eat a whole lot, there's often been that food insecurity. And there's a dangerous myth that children in bigger bodies, where we might say, well, obviously they had enough food, they weren't food insecure. And that's really dangerous, because that leads us to not then nurture these children with food in the same way that we might a child in a smaller body. And we know that food insecurity is very much tied to higher weight and eating disorders. And so this is a really, really difficult piece in our culture that really there's a lot of stigma around weight. We know that people in bigger bodies are judged even by doctors, and by children as young as 4, think of them as lazy and stupid. And that's really painful to live in our culture in a bigger body. So we want to sort of protect our kids and try to prevent that. But a really important message, just like with low appetite, is for kids with big appetite. The more we try to get them to eat less and control their portions to get them to eat and weigh less, the more that's going to backfire. So having a kid who shows up at age 3 who's food preoccupied, we need to feed them, even if they're in a bigger body, the same way we would a sibling. So they might eat a lot at those meals every 2 to 3 hours. But that also tends to calm down, that food preaction tends to calm down with regular meals and snacks and unconditional love. So it's a really tricky thing, because our whole culture and the doctors are saying, you've got to get them to lose weight. But we know if we restrict kids and teens who diet, even sensible dieting, like pushing fruits and vegetables or trying to fill them up with water, we know that those kids end up heavier, more depression, more anxiety, and more eating disorders. So this is another really, really tricky issue and kind of a leap of faith. But loving your children unconditionally, no matter what their bodies look like, is really the best thing that we can do for them. So very, very tricky issue. I hope that answered some of your questions.
It did. I was sitting here thinking on, some of the tips for just getting your kids to try a variety of things, I would be assuming that you wouldn't be suggesting that we would be feeding ice creams in different flavors and putting sprinkles. Well, maybe you would put sprinkles in food because it's really not very caloric anyway. Would you change anything from that respect if you've got a child who is overweight?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think that depends on the family too. If you have a child who's underweight and a child who's quote overweight, feeding them differently sets up major battles and battles between the kids. And I want to just mention, it's very rare that you need to be feeding ice cream to any child, 5 times a day. So I don't see that scenario happening, but I would let all of the children have access to dessert and dessert with meal times. That's another piece of this puzzle that I haven't gotten to. So the 2 pieces of advice that are the most helpful to decrease power struggles and help kids to decrease preoccupation with those sweets that we worry about. Number 1 is serving foods family style, letting kids serve themselves and not have to eat certain foods before they can have dessert. And number 2 is serving a portion of dessert with the meal. And it just takes the sweets off the pedestal. And yes, they'll eat dessert first for a while, but then fairly quickly, I often see kids having dessert and then going back to having a bite of chicken and then a lick of the popsicle, and then they might eat a bite of carrot stick. So serving sweets with the meal is very helpful. So again, this is a really tricky thing for kids in bigger bodies. We feel like we have to get them to eat less or different foods, and most of those efforts will backfire. So I hope that answered that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it certainly did. After hearing countless women report feeling unseen or forgotten after placing their child for adoption, the team at Solace began carefully curating artisan-made items from small businesses to fit in gift boxes especially for birth moms. The boxes now come in 3 adoption-sensitive themes, and they are the perfect gift with the intention for birth moms on holidays, birthdays, and major life events. It's another way of just simply saying, I'm thinking of you, and obviously we are. You can purchase or donate a Solace gift box for birth mothers by visiting adoptsolace, SOLACE.com. Or you can find them on Instagram at adoptsolace. Why do we see, I think we do see that kids from foster care or institutional settings have a tendency to become larger than optimal for their health. Why is that?
Well, we've talked a little bit about food insecurity. That's a big one. So again, food insecurity is linked with 5 times higher odds of being higher weight in the studies. And it makes sense. This is absolutely a resilient strategy. If you're a kid, think about for those listening, when you last dieted, what did you think about? My last diet, so trigger warning for diet and weight talk, but my last diet was, 18 years ago. It was South Beach, and all I wanted was that darn bowl of cereal that I wasn't allowed to have for 2 weeks. I was completely focused on that at work. And imagine that focus for a child who doesn't have control, doesn't know when it's coming, doesn't have the cognitive framing. So if they weren't fed for 8, 12 hours, when that food shows up, they're going to eat as much of it as they can and as fast as they can. And that's good. That's our body's survival mechanism. That's resilient. So we see patterns of eating lots of food, the food insecurity piece of it. And when we don't have reliable access to food, especially if there's been a time early on where they had malnutrition, that also impacts hormones. So again, when children are in fight, flight, or freeze, their insulin is acting in different ways. Cortisol levels are way up. So the cortisol, the insulin, the gut motility, I think leads to higher weight. And so adverse childhood events, those ACEs scores, food insecurity. Children in bigger bodies also tend to get teased and bullied, and there's shame. 1/3 of kids are teased by family members. So when there's shame around it, we see more sneaking of foods and more eating when they're not hungry. And attempts to try to get kids to lose weight leads to higher weight. So that may be part of this too, if a child's been restricted or there have been dieting messages that they've gotten as well. So lots of reasons for this, the trauma, the food insecurity, lots of environmental reasons. Some kids are just going to be in bigger bodies, and we also have to accept that. It doesn't mean we ignore health. We can do a lot to promote health without the goal of losing weight. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to also mention a piece that's really important to reduce the fear, because I had a child in a bigger body with a huge appetite who was food preoccupied. So I had to do a lot of reading around this. And as a physician, I treated diabetes and heart disease and all of these things. A lot of what we attribute to higher weight is more convincingly linked to adverse childhood environment and trauma. So a lot of what we blame on being in the bigger body is really from the early difficult environment where the body had all that wear and tear, the immune system changes. So I want to just, if that helps anyone, to take a deep breath, that addressing, healing the trauma, building the child's resilience, social connection, love. When we look at public health, social connections and love has a far more impactful presence for health than the BMI or body mass index, or even, than smoking. So it is a health intervention to focus on felt safety, love, and connection. It helps their bodies, helps their heart, lungs, immune system, energy storage all function in better ways. So I'm not saying to ignore health at all. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear too.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we like to end with tips. You've already given some great ones. Are there other tips, practical tips that you would like parents to know as it relates to feeding their children and nutrition in general?
Yeah, so many, but I'll try to limit it.
You don't have to. I love your tips. So yeah.
Well, I again, the book is full of them.
Sure it is.
And also on my website, there are some stories from children and just to help with that fear, like serving dessert with dinner. I get a lot of resistance on that. So I did a whole blog post, maybe you can link to it, called Parents on Serving Dessert with Dinner. And it just quotes, probably a dozen parents who were reluctant and what their experience was with it. Because that's what we, as other parents, we want to really hear from others who tried it and where it worked. So I wanted to share that. Now, when I said, so here's again where the flexibility piece comes in. I think this is important. When I said family style serving, I get a lot of questions in. So I've started talking about modified family style serving. I'm also on Instagram, by the way, sharing lots of reels and really quick bites of these kinds of tips. But let's say you have 3 kids at the table and you put down, I always use tacos as an example. There's taco meat, or maybe you're using, vegetarian version of that, but there's something that most of the kids like and it's expensive. So there's a limited amount. And they're fighting over it, and you see their anxiety rise, particularly food preoccupied kids. If they sense that scarcity, they're going to just be focused, and it's going to trigger that food preoccupation. So you might do things like serve the taco meat for them. So if they're worried about everything being fair, you get a 1/3 cup scoop and you put that amount on the plate, and everyone gets their share. And then maybe the table is more full of rice and beans or tortilla chips or this and the other things that they can also fill up on. Some children with brain-based differences may find it really anxiety provoking to serve themselves, whether it's motor planning or they have decision fatigue at the end of the day. So it's okay to serve children food, or if they have, say, a motor deficit or they eat very slowly, you can serve them and do it in ways that preserve their autonomy. So you might hold up the serving spoon and say this much, and they can say more or less, and then point to me on your plate where you want it. So they have a sense of control along the way. So that's the kind of thing when I talk about flexibility and following them. If you have a child, this rarely happens, and usually it's with fetal alcohol or lots of letters behind the name. Some children will want to be told how much to eat. And so if you have a child where you're suddenly saying you can have as much as you want, and they're crying and saying, tell me I can stop, or can I stop now? Again, I've very rarely heard this, but absolutely prioritize that felt safety and say, yeah, you can stop now, or would you like me to serve for you? So again, it's that flexibility of what's working for the child in front of you. So that's a little bit about modified family style, because I get a lot of questions about that. Also, there are ways to support nutrition while you're working on all this other stuff. So if your child likes goldfish crackers, there are, whole grain fortified goldfish crackers. There is protein fortified pasta, or fiber fortified juices, calcium fortified juice if they're not having dairy. So if there are foods that they enjoy and it doesn't change the flavor or bother them, you can get some of these fortified foods to boost nutrition. Orange juice, some of them have DHA. You might, if they're not eating any chia seeds or fish, you might do a DHA gummy chew. So there are different ways of supporting nutrition while you're waiting for these skills. And okay, so here's a couple of things to avoid. Sneaking, to me, is a big no-no. So sneaking more nutrient-dense foods, I've seen this blow up in people's faces terribly. I remember a mom said, I tried putting riced cauliflower in his scrambled eggs, and of course they'll find it because they have little detectors, and now he won't even eat the eggs anymore. It breaks that trust. Now they don't trust that you're not going to mess with their food. So mom was distraught. She said, what scrambled eggs were the most nutritious thing he ate, and now he won't even eat those. So really preserving that trust with kids is important. So I definitely think avoiding sneaking is important as well. So another tip is to serve foods many ways, many times. And I think that's just a good mantra to remember. So let's take blueberries, for example. If that's something you enjoy, taking them blueberry picking is awesome. You might have blueberry jam. You might make some pancakes where half of them have blueberries in it. You might either purchase or bake muffins that have blueberries. Children who enjoy sensory input, you can have crunchy freeze-dried fruits and vegetables now. So a freeze-dried blueberry, maybe you put blueberries in a smoothie, you serve a little bowl of frozen blueberries. So there are lots of ways to serve foods, and serving them over and over again, because they might not really be interested the first 5 or 6 times, but especially if it's something you enjoy, to keep serving those foods many ways, many times. And that is often a really helpful tip. So, I think
excellent.
I could go on and on, but I think I'll stop there and see if you have any other specific last questions.
No, that was excellent. That I so appreciate. I was smiling at the sneaking. You hear all the time. Those are the parenting tricks. So how you put spinach in the smoothie, which I happen to like. I will think it's actually a good sneak. However, having the child see you do it, I totally appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Katia Roel. I really appreciate your wisdom, author of the book, Love Me, Feed Me, in the 2nd edition. So thank you so much for being with us today.